All right, let's dive into a really fascinating moment in history. We're going to talk about the very first time a government ever tried to get a handle on a massive, rogue corporation that had basically gone off the rails. We're talking about the Regulating Act of 1773.
And really, this whole story boils down to one huge question, one that was a massive deal back then and honestly feels more relevant than ever today. What happens when a company gets more powerful than an actual country?
So to really get why this act even needed to exist, we have to look at just how completely out of control the East India Company had become. It's kind of a wild story.
Things went from 0 to 100 real quick. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company wasn't just a trading business anymore. Boom, it was a political power. It was a ruler. But with all that power came unbelievable corruption. Throughout the 1760s, its own officials were getting ridiculously rich off bribes and secret side deals, while the company itself, it was bleeding cash. By 1772, it was a total crisis. The company that literally ruled a subcontinent was about to go bankrupt.
Now, you can't just let a corporation that big fail. It would have set off a massive financial bomb back in Britain. So, the British Parliament knew they had to do something. They had no choice but to step in.
And their solution was this: the Regulating Act of 1773. But look, this wasn't just some boring new law. This was a huge deal. It was the first ever serious attempt by a government to take control of a giant multinational corporation, to fix its corruption, and to sort out its absolute chaos. Nobody had ever tried anything like this before. So, you're probably wondering, how do you even begin to regulate a company that has its own army and its own territory? Well, the Act's whole plan was to basically tear up the old rulebook and write a completely new one. The strategy was a complete top-to-bottom overhaul. First up, they centralized power. The governor of Bengal got a major promotion to governor general, a much more powerful role. But to keep that new power in check, they immediately created a system of checks and balances, an executive council of 4 people who had to approve his decisions. Next, they unified control over the whole operation, making the other big territories, Bombay and Madras, answer to this new central command in Bengal. Then, to deal with the chaos, they brought in the rule of law, creating a brand new Supreme Court in Calcutta. And to get right to the heart of the problem, they went after corruption head-on, flat-out banning company employees from taking gifts or running their own private businesses on the side. And finally, the most important part, accountability. The company now had to send all its reports, revenue, civil, military, everything, straight to the British government. No more secrets.
It was a seriously bold plan, right? A radical move to bring order to chaos. But, as it turned out, the whole thing was built on a really flawed foundation.
Now, don't get me wrong, this act was a monumental moment in history. It was the very beginning of parliamentary control over India, and it laid the groundwork for what would become the British Raj. But it was even bigger than that. It completely changed the relationship between a government and a corporation, forever. It set a precedent that we are still dealing with today when we argue about how to regulate big tech or global finance. But here was the fatal flaw. The act created 2 supreme powers in India. You had the Governor General with all the executive power, and then you had the Supreme Court with all the judicial power. The problem? The act never bothered to say where one person's power ended and the other's began. It created this massive gray area that guaranteed they would clash. And they did, immediately, sparking this constant power struggle right from day one. And that brings us to the ultimate question about this whole thing. Looking back, was the Regulating Act really about regulating a broken company? Or was it something more? Was it the first calculated step in a government takeover, using a corporate crisis as the perfect excuse to seize an empire? It's a question that makes you rethink the very idea of corporate regulation.